Easter is a time of celebration of life over death, of light over darkness, of love over hate. Easter is a time when we can put the past behind us and look with greater expectation to the future in the assurance that day follows night because that's the way that God has planned it. The record of the resurrection can never be put down to the wishful thinking of the disciples. Without exception, they were dismayed and disillusioned after the crucifixion. Just think, these men had left their families, their jobs, their communities to follow this man from Nazareth, because they thought he was someone who knew about life, who had charisma, who promised life and satisfaction, who had compassion and the power to heal, who was a great teacher, who was able to speak with confidence about God at a time when belief in God or gods was a given, and the skeptics were virtually unknown. They may well have had thoughts that this man was the Messiah, who, according to some of the prophecies, would destroy the enemies of Israel, currently the Romans, and bring about a period of peace and prosperity. And Jesus seemed to have everything going for him. Sickness, even leprosy, had no power in his presence. The demons were being cast out with no exceptions, so life was beginning to take on new meaning and hope as Jesus' power and popularity seemed to be increasing. And suddenly, maybe within a week, the whole castle they had built came crashing down, and the enemies of Jesus had prevailed. Within the week after his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, he was crucified as a terrorist, and the disciples were scared stiff they would be the next victims. So the last thing we can impute to them is that they got together and concocted this story about the empty tomb and the risen Lord. They had neither the nous nor the courage to plan such an ambitious deception. Had this all been a deliberate attempt to create a story where there was none, they wouldn't have named women as the main witnesses in an age when women's testimony carried little weight. They would have got together to check that they were all telling the same story, so that the account we would have would be much more consistent than it is. And of course, if it was all a concocted story, it's absolutely incredible that one after another of these early disciples suffered abuse, persecution, and death, yet not one ever spilled the beans and admitted their message was a fraud. And we have the church here today as proof of the constancy and the courage of those early apostles. No other explanation can really carry the weight of the birth and growth of the church than the one provided by the Gospels. Against everyone's expectation, Jesus rose from the dead and was alive again. In all the early preaching and in the writings of the New Testament, the crucifixion and the resurrection are bound together. I believe this has a deep theological meaning. Life comes through death. Even light is only significant in darkness. Many things can only be seen by seeing what are their opposites. And this has real significance for us today. If the disciples, thinking of their situations, were depressed, disillusioned, or even dismayed, this surely says something to people today who might think themselves in a similar situation. When we look at the international situation, with the conflicts unresolved in so many countries, little seems to give us much cause for hope. We might be in the same situation of depression as those early disciples. But God is not without ways to bring about his will and to further his program. So, however unlikely or even impossible a resurrection might be considered, there is really no other explanation to make sense of the rise of the church. Started by unlearned peasants from Galilee, their message within one generation had reached virtually the ends of the then known world. convincing the high and low, the rich and the poor, the educated and uneducated. Till today, there is something over 1 billion followers of this man from Galilee. As even the most determined skeptic might say, something must have happened to have started this irresistible force that within 3 centuries conquered the then known world. What a reversal! The mighty Roman Empire is a thing of history, and this peasant from Galilee has influenced more people today than probably any other person in history. And today is the day we celebrate the big turnaround. Jesus was dead, but he is alive forevermore. Looking at the cross, one would think the victory was of hate over goodwill, but Jesus was forgiving even the soldiers who drove the nails through his living flesh. Neither their hatred nor their indifference could overcome his love or shut off his forgiveness. For a brief period, hope appeared to have overcome despair, but have been overcome by despair. But within 2 months, when one would have expected all the fishermen from Galilee to have returned to their trade, here they were in Jerusalem preaching with a power that converted hundreds, even thousands. And the chief priests had thought they'd got rid of the menace. So in a sense, the cross itself was a victory, showing the strength of love and of forgiveness. But in another sense, the cross needed the resurrection to open the eyes of people so that they could see and rightly interpret the death of Jesus. I think we'd have to admit that without the resurrection, we would never have been able to recognize the cross as a victory. The torture is too prolonged and too cruel for any observer to think other than that it is an appalling horror. It needed a complete reassessment of the whole situation for anybody to be able to see it as something from which good could come. But without the cross, there could be no resurrection. The two belong together. Likewise, when we view our own situations from close at hand, frequently we are unable to see the big picture. We become aware of the present sufferings, the present humiliation, and we cannot see beyond this to any good consequence. But in the providence of God, he can work all things for good for those who love him. In this case, it needed God to intervene directly, or so it seems to us. But in normal circumstances, we look carefully to see how good might result from whatever suffering we might be enduring. The cross and resurrection as a single act reassures us that nothing is beyond the power of God. So again, Easter is a time for rejoicing. The message of Easter is not about the failure of the high priests and of the Romans, but about the victory of God against all odds. And it is a final and conclusive victory, for it is the victory over the final enemy, death. At Easter, death is shown to be not the end, but actually the gateway through to life. Easter didn't end in a tomb. In fact, it hasn't ended yet. When the end will come, who knows? But it will not be decided by death. For if death is defeated or past, what enemy is there left to fear? We can say the gateway to life is through death. This is the way to go. Death is not the end, but it is still there and it has to be conquered. And Easter tells us that as it was conquered once, so it can be conquered again and again and again. So in what way does the fact of Easter change our views or understanding of the cross and of suffering? A prayer found in the famous poem Fruit Gathering by the famous Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. It reads, "Let me not pray to be sheltered from dangers, but to be fearless in facing them. Let me not beg for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it. Let me not look for allies in life's battlefield, but to my own strength. Let me not crave in anxious fear to be saved, but hope for the patience to win my freedom. Grant me that I may not be a coward, feeling your mercy in my success alone, but let me find the grasp of your hand in my failure. Paul makes it very clear. Jesus' victory was over death, yet it was achieved through death. Eternal life was possible only because Jesus was prepared first to die. So we recognize first that Easter is a day of celebration. We recognize that Jesus is alive, never to die again. We rejoice that he brings life and immortality to life. We rejoice that because he lives, we shall live also. Because of his death and resurrection, his Father is now our Father, and he calls us brothers and sisters. We are part of his family. We are part of his body. Easter is a time of hope. Although God apparently does not interfere deliberately in our affairs to frustrate our plans or to coerce us into right action, nevertheless, in the ultimate plan of the universe, harmony is stronger than dissension. Love is stronger than hate. Life is stronger than death. So Easter tells us that death does not have the final say. Easter is a time of celebration. So far, the commercial world hasn't quite made inroads into it as it has at Christmas, but they're making progress. Christmas trees are hardly packed away before it's time to buy Easter eggs. Perhaps this isn't the time to binge, but really, the media and the commercial world are moulding our aspirations and way of life far too much. Of course, other groups will complain that the church is only a killjoy and point to the joys of shopping and of opening presents on Christmas morning or searching for Easter eggs on Easter Day. And no doubt these are things we do enjoy. But so frequently they displace things which give much deeper satisfaction. Life and happiness do not consist in the abundance of material things. Money doesn't buy happiness, even if it makes misery more endurable. So let us rejoice and let us have hope that the message of the resurrection, of the victory of light over darkness, of love over hate, is permanent. Let us not be dismayed, no matter what difficulties we might face, for God will give us strength and fortitude to overcome, even as he enabled Jesus to overcome hatred with love and overcome death with life.